Have you ever noticed that peculiar contradiction? How the goodness celebrated in Christian morality so often coincides with a certain diminishment of vitality, a curious weakening of natural human power. It's one of those patterns that hides in plain sight, so deeply embedded in our cultural understanding of virtue that we rarely pause to question it. Think about the qualities most celebrated as Christian virtues: meekness, humility, self-denial, obedience, surrender. There's something striking about this pattern. Almost all these virtues involve some form of self-diminishment, some reduction of natural human potency, some restraint of vital force. There's something almost suspicious about this consistent correlation between Christian goodness and the weakening of natural human power. The contradiction extends beyond mere language into lived experience. The good Christian, who appears serene on the surface, yet seems strangely constrained. The saint whose holiness coincides with a peculiar pallor of personality. The devout believer whose moral purity seems to require constant vigilance against their own natural impulses. In each case, goodness appears inseparable from a certain diminishment of vital force, as if the price of virtue is the weakening of natural human power. There's something curious about this pattern, a suspicious correlation that warrants deeper investigation. This paradox becomes even more intriguing when we notice how consistently Christian texts frame moral goodness in opposition to natural human impulses. Deny yourself, crucify the flesh, put to death the deeds of the body. These aren't random spiritual insights, but follow a systematic pattern. Goodness is consistently equated with the suppression of natural vitality, with victory over natural human impulses, with the subjugation of what might be called the will to power. There's something almost too convenient about the consistency of this framing. The uncomfortable question lurking beneath this pattern is disturbing. What if Christian goodness isn't primarily motivated by love at all? What if the psychological foundation of Christian virtue isn't compassion or benevolence, but something far less noble? Specifically, the fear of one's own natural power? What if the good Christian is good, not because they love so deeply, but because they fear so profoundly what they might be if they fully express their natural vitality? This isn't merely an academic question. It strikes at the heart of Western morality, challenging our most basic assumptions about virtue, goodness, and the psychological foundations of ethical behavior. If Christian goodness is motivated primarily by fear of our own natural power, rather than by love of others, how might this distort our understanding of virtue itself? What might become possible if we distinguished between a goodness born of fear and a goodness born of strength? And who better to guide us through this uncomfortable territory than a man who spent his life examining the psychological foundations of Western morality? A philosopher whose father and grandfathers were Lutheran pastors, giving him intimate knowledge of Christian virtue from the inside. A thinker whose commitment to intellectual honesty led him to question not just specific moral teachings, but the very psychological foundations of our conception of goodness. What if I told you that over a century ago, one of history's most penetrating minds uncovered this pattern and traced its implications to their unsettling conclusion? A thinker who recognized that behind the serene mask of Christian virtue often lurks something much less noble: the fear of one's own natural power, the terror of one's own vital instincts, the dread of what one might become if freed from moral constraints. What might we learn by following his investigation? Why do we find it so difficult to question the psychological foundations of Christian goodness? Could it be that entire moral systems have benefited from keeping these foundations hidden? What if the ultimate moral revolution isn't rejecting goodness, but transforming its psychological foundation, from fear of power to expression of power, from terror of vitality to affirmation of life? The answers to these questions might challenge your most basic assumptions about virtue, goodness, and the psychological foundations of ethical behavior. They offer a perspective on Christian morality not as triumph of love, but as sophisticated expression of fear. Fear disguised as its opposite. Are you ready to follow where they lead? There's a striking pattern in Christian morality that becomes visible once you start looking for it. A pattern so consistent, it can't be dismissed as coincidence. It emerges in the peculiar correlation between moral goodness and the suppression of natural human power, between virtue and self-diminishment, between sanctity and the weakening of vital force. This pattern doesn't appear randomly. It follows a specific and predictable trajectory, revealing itself most clearly in how Christian virtue is consistently defined in opposition to natural human impulses. Consider how goodness is framed in Christian texts and traditions. The good Christian is the one who denies themselves, who takes up their cross, who mortifies the flesh, who crucifies their passions. The virtuous believer is the one who restrains natural impulses, who subdues bodily desires, who conquers the self. The saint is the one who achieves the most complete victory over natural vitality, who most thoroughly subjugates what might be called the will to power. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Goodness is systematically equated with the suppression of natural human power and the diminishment of vital force. What makes this pattern truly revealing isn't its occasional appearance, but its remarkable consistency across diverse aspects of Christian morality. The specific theological details may change, the cultural expressions may shift, but the psychological function remains strikingly consistent. Virtue is systematically defined as the victory over natural human power, as the subjugation of vital instincts, as the diminishment of what Nietzsche would call the will to power. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. This pattern becomes even more intriguing when we notice how it manifests in the psychological profiles of those considered most virtuous. The saints, those paragons of Christian virtue, consistently display a particular relationship to power, not its expression, but its suppression, not its affirmation, but its denial, not its enhancement, but its diminishment. The holiest individuals are precisely those who most thoroughly subordinate natural vitality to moral restraint. The pattern continues. Sanctity correlates with the most complete victory over natural human power. The anomaly extends beyond individual psychology into the conception of Jesus himself. The Christ of Christian tradition is portrayed not primarily as embodiment of natural human power, but as its voluntary surrender, not as expression of vital force, but as its sacrificial offering. Not my will, but thine be done becomes the quintessential expression of virtue, framing goodness as the subordination of natural will to divine command. The pattern repeats. Even the central figure of Christianity models virtue as the surrender of natural power, rather than its expression. What's particularly striking about this pattern is how rarely we acknowledge it explicitly. We discuss Christian virtue, morality, and sanctity at length, but we seldom examine this specific correlation, how consistently goodness is equated with the suppression of natural human power. It's as if we've collectively agreed not to notice how Christian virtue systematically coincides with a certain diminishment of vital force, a curious weakening of natural human potency. And that's where our investigation truly begins, with the recognition that Christian goodness might be serving psychological functions quite different from those explicitly claimed. What if the virtue celebrated in Christian morality isn't primarily motivated by love of others, but by fear of oneself? What if the good Christian is good not because they love so deeply, but because they fear so profoundly what they might be if they fully expressed their natural power? This is the question that haunted a 19th century philosopher whose insights into human psychology were so profound, so disturbing, that they continue to challenge us today. A man who dared to ask whether our most cherished conceptions of virtue might be serving very different psychological purposes than we imagine. What did Friedrich Nietzsche discover about this strange relationship between Christian goodness and the fear of natural human power? And why does his discovery remain so unsettling and potentially liberating more than a century later? What if the saints aren't the most loving, but the most afraid of their own potential? This question leads us to Nietzsche's disturbing insight. The saints are those who most fear their own strength. In the autumn of 1887, Friedrich Nietzsche was working on what would become one of his most controversial works, On the Genealogy of Morals. At 43, he was at the height of his philosophical powers, yet still largely unrecognized by the intellectual establishment. His books sold poorly, sometimes fewer than 100 copies, and he lived in near isolation in various European locations as his meager pension allowed. His health was deteriorating. Violent migraines, stomach ailments, and failing eyesight regularly confined him to darkened rooms for days at a time. It was within this context of physical suffering and public indifference that Nietzsche formulated his most penetrating insights about the psychological foundations of Christian morality. His personal circumstances provided a unique vantage point from which to examine virtue and goodness. Having grown up as the son of a Lutheran pastor, with both grandfathers also pastors, Nietzsche had intimate knowledge of Christian morality from the inside. He was raised in an environment saturated with notions of virtue, piety, and goodness. Yet his own intellectual journey had led him to question whether the psychological motivations underlying Christian virtue might be quite different from those explicitly claimed, whether goodness might be motivated not primarily by love, but by a more complex and disturbing psychological dynamic. What made Nietzsche's perspective on Christian morality especially valuable wasn't merely his philosophical brilliance, but the convergence of his personal experience with his intellectual journey. Here was a man who had been immersed in Christian virtue from childhood, yet possessed the rare intellectual courage to question its psychological foundations. Each day, as he navigated both his physical pain and his intellectual isolation, Nietzsche lived the very question at the heart of his philosophy. Could virtue emerge from natural human power rather than from its suppression? Might goodness be an expression of strength rather than a reaction to fear? During his periods of relative physical relief, Nietzsche would write in small notebooks, developing what would become one of his most disturbing insights, that Christian virtue isn't primarily motivated by love of others, but by fear of oneself, specifically fear of one's own natural power, one's vital instincts, one's will to life. The good Christian is good not because they love so deeply, but because they fear so profoundly what they might be if they fully expressed their natural potency. In his notebooks from this period, filled with his increasingly aphoristic writing style, Nietzsche began to articulate a disturbing hypothesis that Christian morality functions psychologically not to enhance human potential, but to constrain it, not to elevate humanity, but to domesticate it through sophisticated mechanisms of self-fear and self-suppression. As he would later write in The Antichrist, what is good? All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness. This wasn't mere provocation, but profound psychological insight. Virtue might emerge not from the suppression of natural power, but from its enhancement and refinement. What made this insight especially powerful was that it didn't come from abstract theorizing, but from Nietzsche's meticulous analysis of how Christian morality actually functions in human psychology. He noticed something that few had articulated before: how consistently Christian virtue coincides with a certain diminishment of vital force, a curious weakening of natural human power. This wasn't mere coincidence, but revealed something profound about the psychological foundations of Christian goodness, that it might be motivated not primarily by love, but by a more complex and disturbing psychological dynamic centered around fear of one's own natural potency. It was this recognition of the hidden psychological foundation of Christian virtue that gave Nietzsche's moral critique its unusual penetration and emotional force. He wasn't merely rejecting Christian ethics as false. He was uncovering what he saw as its hidden psychological motivation: not love, but fear; not compassion, but terror of one's own natural power. As he would later write in Twilight of the Idols, the Christian conception of God is one of the most corrupt conceptions of the divine ever attained on earth. This wasn't mere rhetorical flourish, but recognition of what Nietzsche saw as Christianity's fundamental psychological project: the transformation of natural human power into something requiring constant moral management and constraint. This is the context from which Nietzsche would develop his unsettling analysis of Christian goodness as disguised fear. It wasn't merely a critique of specific moral teachings, but a profound psychological insight into how virtue functions within Christian morality. What evidence did Nietzsche find for this disturbing pattern? And what implications might it have for our understanding of goodness, virtue, and the possibility of ethics beyond the foundation of fear? Nietzsche's first evidence for his hypothesis came through his meticulous examination of Christian texts and moral teachings. With the careful eye of a trained philologist, he traced how goodness was defined and celebrated across Christian tradition. What he discovered was a striking pattern that few had bothered to notice: the systematic correlation between virtue and the suppression of natural human power, between goodness and the diminishment of vital force, between sanctity and the weakening of what he would call the will to power. In On the Genealogy of Morals, published in 1887, Nietzsche offered his initial observations of this pattern. The slave revolt in morality begins when resentment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values. The resentment of natures that are denied the true reaction, that of deeds, and compensate themselves with an imaginary revenge. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that Christian morality emerged not primarily from love, but from a particular psychological response to powerlessness. Specifically, the transformation of powerlessness into virtue, weakness into moral superiority, the inability to express power into the renunciation of power. What made this observation so penetrating wasn't merely identifying Christian morality's historical development, which others had examined before, but recognizing its psychological function, how it systematically transforms natural human power into something morally suspect, requiring constant vigilance and restraint. The good Christian isn't simply loving, they're engaged in constant self-surveillance, perpetual self-suspicion, ongoing moral self-management. Goodness becomes not the expression of natural human potential, but its careful constraint through sophisticated mechanisms of self-fear. Nietzsche found evidence for this pattern in how Christian texts frame the relationship between virtue and natural human impulses. From Paul's letters with their emphasis on the war between flesh and spirit, to Augustine's confessions with their constant self-suspicion, from medieval penitential practices to Protestant self-examination, Christian tradition consistently portrays virtue as victory over natural impulses, rather than their integration and refinement. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Goodness is systematically equated with the suppression of natural human power, with the triumph over vital instincts, with the subjugation of what Nietzsche would call the will to power. This insight gained further support from Nietzsche's analysis of the psychological profile of the saint, that paragon of Christian virtue. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, "The ascetic makes a necessity of virtue." This deceptively simple statement reveals Nietzsche's recognition that Christian sanctity emerges not from the enhancement of natural human capacities, but from their systematic suppression, not from the affirmation of life, but from its partial denial through sophisticated mechanisms of self-constraint. The saint achieves goodness precisely through victory over natural human power. Perhaps most compelling was Nietzsche's observation of how Jesus himself was transformed within Christian tradition. The historical Jesus, as Nietzsche reconstructed him from the Gospels, embodied a particular psychological state, characterized by freedom from resentment and the transcendence of conventional moral distinctions. Yet Christianity rapidly transformed this psychological state into a moral ideal requiring constant vigilance against natural impulses. Jesus became not the model of natural human flourishing, but the symbol of its sacrificial offering. "Not my will, but thine be done." The pattern continued. Even the central figure of Christianity was transformed from embodiment of psychological freedom into model of self-surrender. This observation allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that Christian virtue isn't primarily motivated by love of others, but by fear of oneself. Specifically, fear of one's own natural power, one's vital instincts, one's will to life. As he writes in The Antichrist, "The Christian is not a person who lives in a certain way. The Christian is the person who accepts certain teachings." This isn't mere criticism, but profound psychological insight. Christianity transforms the expression of natural human power into something requiring constant moral management and constraint. What makes this evidence so compelling isn't any single instance, but the consistent pattern across Christian texts, moral teachings, and psychological profiles of the virtuous. The same correlation appears again and again. Virtue is systematically equated with the suppression of natural human power, with the diminishment of vital force, with the weakening of what Nietzsche would call the will to power. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. As Nietzsche deepened his investigation, he discovered that the relationship between Christian goodness and fear wasn't merely incidental, but foundational. That fear of natural human power wasn't just one element of Christian morality, but its essential psychological dynamic. The specific theological details might change across Christian history, but the basic psychological pattern remained consistent. Virtue as sophisticated response to fear, goodness as complex management of terror, sanctity as triumph over the dread of one's own potential. In Beyond Good and Evil, published in 1886, Nietzsche expanded this analysis. The noble soul has reverence for itself. This deceptively simple statement reveals his understanding that authentic virtue might emerge not from fear of one's natural power, but from its reverence, not from self-suspicion, but from self-affirmation. Yet Christian morality consistently promotes the opposite view, that goodness requires constant vigilance against natural impulses, perpetual suspicion toward vital instincts, ongoing management of what might emerge if moral constraints were relaxed. What made this insight especially powerful was Nietzsche's recognition that this psychological dynamic wasn't merely theoretical, but revealed itself in the lived experience of Christian virtue. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he writes, "One virtue is more of a virtue than two, because it is more of a knot for fate to cling to." This enigmatic statement points to his understanding that authentic virtue emerges from the integration of natural human impulses rather than their moral management, from the expression of vital force rather than its constraint through sophisticated mechanisms of self-fear. Nietzsche began to see that this pattern revealed something essential about how Christian morality functions psychologically, not primarily to enhance human potential, but to constrain it through sophisticated mechanisms of self-fear. By teaching people to fear their own natural power, Christianity creates internal psychological division where none previously existed, transforming the expression of vital impulses from natural human activity into moral battlefield requiring constant vigilance and restraint. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most disturbing insights, that Christian goodness is motivated not primarily by love, but by fear disguised as its opposite. As he writes in The Antichrist, "What is good? All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness." This isn't mere provocation, but profound psychological insight. Authentic virtue might emerge not from the suppression of natural human power, but from its enhancement and refinement, not from fear of vital impulses, but from their integration into meaningful expression. The pattern became increasingly clear. Christian goodness functions psychologically not primarily to enhance human potential, but to constrain it through sophisticated mechanisms of self-fear. By teaching people to fear their own natural power, Christianity creates internal division that prevents the integration of vital impulses into authentic expression. The good Christian is engaged not simply in loving others, but in complex self-surveillance, perpetual self-suspicion, ongoing moral self-management motivated fundamentally by fear of what might emerge if constraints were relaxed. This insight allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that the psychological appeal of Christian morality lies precisely in its ability to transform the anxiety of power into the comfort of constraint. As he writes in The Gay Science, "The desire for a redeemer, the believer in the Redeemer, neither is necessarily connected with that one individual who claimed to be God's Son." This passage reveals his understanding that Christianity's psychological power emerges not primarily from its theological claims, but from its ability to provide sophisticated management of the terror of human potential, to transform the anxiety of freedom into the comfort of constraint. What implications might this understanding have for our conception of goodness, virtue, and the possibility of ethics beyond the foundation of fear? And what might it reveal about the possibility of virtue emerging not from the suppression of natural human power, but from its enhancement and refinement? Nietzsche's investigation was leading him toward a disturbing conclusion, that Christian goodness represents not the triumph of love, but the sophisticated management of fear, that the good Christian is motivated not primarily by compassion for others, but by terror of their own natural potential. As Nietzsche continued his investigation, a striking pattern emerged across diverse aspects of Christian morality. The relationship between goodness and fear wasn't isolated to particular doctrines or practices, but appeared with remarkable consistency throughout Christian ethics. The pattern was clear: virtue as sophisticated response to fear, goodness as complex management of terror, sanctity as triumph over the dread of one's own natural potential. A systematic transformation of fear into moral framework, serving as its psychological inverse. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche articulated this pattern with characteristic clarity. The slave revolt in morality begins when resentment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values. This passage reveals his recognition that Christian morality emerged not primarily from love, but from a particular psychological response to powerlessness. Specifically, the transformation of powerlessness into virtue, weakness into moral superiority, the inability to express power into the moral condemnation of power itself. This wasn't merely historical observation, but psychological insight. Christian goodness functions as sophisticated management of the fear of both external power and internal potential. The pattern revealed itself in how Christian morality approaches the body and its natural impulses. Rather than integrating bodily desires into meaningful expression, Christian ethics consistently frames them as threats requiring constant moral vigilance. The body becomes not the natural expression of human vitality, but the site of perpetual moral struggle, with natural impulses systematically transformed into temptations requiring surveillance and restraint. The pattern continued. Goodness requires triumph over the body rather than its integration, victory over natural impulses rather than their refinement. In Christian attitudes toward sexuality, the same pattern appeared. Rather than recognizing sexual energy as natural human vitality capable of meaningful expression, Christian ethics consistently frames it as dangerous force requiring moral management. Sexual desire becomes not natural human impulse, but moral battlefield, with virtue defined as victory over this aspect of natural human potential. The pattern persisted. Goodness requires the constraint of sexual energy rather than its integration into meaningful expression. Perhaps most revealing was how this pattern manifested in Christian conceptions of salvation. Rather than framing redemption as the enhancement of natural human potential, Christian theology consistently portrays it as rescue from natural human condition, as salvation from, rather than fulfillment of human nature. The pattern repeated. Goodness requires liberation from natural human condition rather than its enhancement and refinement. What made this pattern so powerful wasn't any single instance, but its remarkable consistency across diverse aspects of Christian ethics. Whether in attitudes toward the body, approaches to sexuality, or conceptions of salvation, the same psychological dynamic operated. Goodness as sophisticated response to fear, virtue as complex management of terror, sanctity as triumph over the dread of one's own natural potential. As Nietzsche writes, the Christian conception of God is one of the most corrupt conceptions of the divine ever attained on earth. This isn't mere provocation, but recognition of how Christianity systematically transforms natural human power into something requiring constant moral management and constraint. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most penetrating insights, that Christian goodness represents not the triumph of love, but the sophisticated management of fear, that behind the serene mask of virtue lurks the terror of one's own natural potential. The good Christian is motivated not primarily by compassion for others, but by complex relationship to their own power. Specifically, the fear of what they might become if moral constraints were relaxed and natural impulses fully expressed. As this pattern became increasingly clear, Nietzsche began to recognize its profound implications. What if Christian goodness serves not primarily to enhance human potential, but to constrain it through sophisticated mechanisms of self-fear? What if the virtue celebrated in Christian ethics emerges not from love, but from terror disguised as its opposite? What if the saints aren't the most loving, but the most afraid of their own natural potential? This recognition wasn't merely an academic observation, but a profound challenge to how we understand goodness, virtue, and the psychological foundations of ethical behavior. If Christian goodness is motivated primarily by fear rather than love, what might become possible if we transformed the psychological foundation of virtue? from fear of power to expression of power, from terror of vitality to affirmation of life. What form of goodness might emerge not from the suppression of natural human potential, but from its enhancement and refinement? As we continue our investigation, we'll explore the deeper implications of Nietzsche's discovery. What does it mean for our understanding of goodness, virtue, and the possibility of ethics beyond the foundation of fear? And what might it reveal about the possibility of virtue emerging not from the suppression of natural human power, but from its enhancement and refinement? The implications of Nietzsche's discovery reach far beyond academic moral philosophy, into the very heart of how we understand goodness, virtue, and the psychological foundations of ethical behavior. If Christian goodness is motivated primarily by fear rather than love, then addressing this pattern requires more than theological refinement. It demands fundamental reconsideration of how we approach virtue itself, not merely its content, but its psychological foundation. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche explored these implications through his concept of the three metamorphoses of the spirit, from camel to lion to child. The camel represents the spirit that bears the weight of traditional morality, dutifully carrying values imposed from outside. The lion represents the courage to say no to these imposed values, creating space for something new. The child represents the capacity for genuine creation, for saying yes to life and creating values that emerge from vital affirmation rather than from fear. This framework reveals Nietzsche's profound insight. Moving beyond Christian morality requires not just rejecting specific moral teachings, but transforming the psychological foundation of virtue itself, from fear of power to expression of power, from terror of vitality to affirmation of life. The first profound implication is psychological. If Christian goodness is motivated primarily by fear, authentic virtue requires psychological integration rather than internal division. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, "What does your conscience say? You shall become the person you are." This isn't mere self-help rhetoric, but profound psychological insight. Authentic virtue emerges not from the suppression of natural impulses, but from their integration into meaningful expression, not from internal division, but from psychological wholeness, not from self-fear, but from self-affirmation. The second implication is ethical. If Christian virtue emerges from fear disguised as love, authentic goodness requires transforming its psychological foundation. As Nietzsche suggests in Beyond Good and Evil, what is done out of love takes place beyond good and evil. This isn't rejection of ethics, but recognition that authentic virtue might emerge not from moral constraint motivated by fear, but from vital expression motivated by abundance, not from the suppression of natural human power, but from its enhancement and refinement into meaningful expression. The third implication is cultural. If Christian morality functions primarily to constrain human potential through sophisticated mechanisms of self-fear, cultural flourishing requires new approaches to ethics beyond this foundation. As Nietzsche writes in The Antichrist, "What is good? All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness." This isn't crude celebration of dominance, but recognition that cultural vitality might emerge not from moral frameworks that constrain human potential, but from ethical approaches that enhance it, not from the management of fear, but from the expression of life. Perhaps the most profound implication is transformative. If goodness has been conceptualized primarily as response to fear, human flourishing requires new understanding of virtue beyond this foundation. As Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "I love him who wants to create beyond himself, and thus perishes." This isn't mere provocative rhetoric, but recognition that authentic virtue might emerge not from the suppression of natural human potential, but from its enhancement and refinement into meaningful creation, not from the constraint of power, but from its expression in forms that enhance rather than diminish life. What does this mean for how we approach goodness, virtue, and the psychological foundations of ethical behavior? If Christian goodness is motivated primarily by fear rather than love, what might become possible if we transformed the psychological foundation of virtue, from fear of power to expression of power, from terror of vitality to affirmation of life? What form of goodness might emerge not from the suppression of natural human potential, but from its enhancement and refinement? As Nietzsche suggests, the path toward authentic virtue begins not with more perfect moral constraint, but with the courage to question moral frameworks themselves, to ask whether what we've been taught to call goodness might actually be sophisticated management of fear disguised as love. The liberation of virtue from fear might open possibilities for ethical life that neither traditional morality nor its critics have fully explored. Possibilities emerging from what Nietzsche saw as the psychological foundation of authentic goodness, not the suppression of natural human power, but its enhancement and refinement into forms that affirm rather than diminish life. The pattern Nietzsche uncovered extends beyond individual psychology into what might be called a conspiracy of virtue, a collective cultural agreement to disguise fear as love, terror as compassion, self-diminishment as goodness. This isn't a conscious conspiracy in the crude sense, but rather a cultural evolution driven by the gap between our explicit moral ideals and their actual psychological foundations. We claim that goodness emerges from love while subtly teaching that virtue requires fear. Fear of one's own natural power, terror of one's own vital instincts, dread of what one might become if moral constraints were relaxed. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche traced how this conspiracy evolved through the historical development of Christian morality. What began as explicit celebration of meekness, humility, and self-denial gradually evolved into more sophisticated moral frameworks that maintained the same basic psychological dynamic. The transformation of natural human power into something requiring constant moral management and constraint. The specific theological details changed, but the basic pattern remained consistent. Virtue as sophisticated response to fear, goodness as complex management of terror, sanctity as triumph over the dread of one's own natural potential. This cultural evolution wasn't driven by malicious intent, but by the gap between our explicit moral ideals and their actual psychological foundations. As Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, I mistrust all systematizers and avoid them. The will to a system is a lack of integrity. This isn't mere provocative statement, but profound insight. Systematic moral frameworks often reflect not intellectual clarity, but psychological need. Specifically, the need to manage the terror of human potential through sophisticated mechanisms of self-constraint disguised as virtue. What makes this pattern particularly compelling is how it manifests across seemingly different moral approaches. Traditional Christian ethics emphasizes humility and self-denial. Modern secular morality emphasizes compassion and harm reduction. Progressive ethics emphasizes inclusivity and justice. Each approach develops its own language, but the basic psychological dynamic often remains consistent. The transformation of natural human power into something requiring constant moral management and constraint. Fear disguised as virtue persists, even as its specific moral content evolves. The conspiracy extends into how we educate children in morality, teaching them to suppress natural impulses rather than integrate them into meaningful expression. It appears in how we approach psychological development, often framing natural human desires as threats requiring management rather than energies capable of refinement. It emerges in how we conceptualize spiritual growth, frequently portraying it as victory over natural impulses rather than their integration into meaningful expression. The pattern persists. Virtue requires the suppression of natural human power rather than its enhancement and refinement. What makes this pattern so powerful isn't any single manifestation, but its remarkable adaptability across diverse moral frameworks. As traditional Christian ethics loses cultural authority in certain contexts, the same basic psychological dynamic often continues through secular forms. The management of fear disguised as compassion, the constraint of power presented as justice, the suppression of natural impulses framed as ethical sophistication. Different moral language, same basic psychological dynamic. Virtue as sophisticated response to fear, goodness as complex management of terror, ethics as triumph over the dread of human potential. This recognition reveals something profound about Western moral psychology, that it often continues the same basic pattern of fear disguised as love, even as the specific moral content evolves. The person who suppresses natural impulses in the name of secular ethics is often engaged in essentially the same psychological dynamic as the person who does so in the name of religious virtue, managing the terror of human potential through sophisticated mechanisms of self-constraint disguised as moral sophistication. Nietzsche's penetrating insight wasn't merely that Christian morality disguises fear as love, but that this psychological pattern persists even as moral frameworks evolve. That behind diverse approaches to ethics often lurks the same basic psychological dynamic, the transformation of natural human power into something requiring constant moral management and constraint. The real conspiracy isn't specific moral content, but the deeper cultural pattern of disguising fear as virtue, terror as compassion, self-diminishment as goodness. This pattern raises profound questions about moral psychology, cultural evolution, and the possibility of ethical life beyond the foundation of fear. If we've been collectively engaged in disguising fear as virtue, what might become possible if we consciously transform the psychological foundation of ethics from fear of power to expression of power, from terror of vitality to affirmation of life? What form of goodness might emerge not from the suppression of natural human potential, but from its enhancement and refinement into forms that affirm rather than diminish life? As we continue our investigation, we'll explore why this pattern has remained largely unacknowledged and what it might mean for the possibility of virtue beyond fear, not through rejection of goodness, but through transformation of its psychological foundation. Why has the relationship between Christian goodness and fear remained largely unacknowledged despite its profound implications for ethical understanding? The answer isn't a conscious cover-up, but rather a collective psychological investment in maintaining the appearance that virtue emerges from love rather than fear. Addressing this pattern would mean questioning not just specific moral teachings, but the very psychological foundations of how we understand goodness itself, a prospect simultaneously liberating and threatening to both individuals and institutions built around traditional conceptions of virtue. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche offers a penetrating insight into this collective avoidance. The falseness of a judgment is not necessarily an objection to a judgment. The question is to what extent it is life-promoting, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps even species-cultivating. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that beliefs persist not primarily because of their truth value, but because of their psychological utility. And few psychological mechanisms are more useful than those that allow us to disguise fear as love, terror as compassion, self-diminishment as virtue. By maintaining the appearance that goodness emerges from love rather than fear, we avoid confronting the disturbing possibility that our virtue might be sophisticated expression of terror rather than triumph of compassion. Religious institutions have an obvious stake in maintaining the appearance that Christian goodness emerges from love rather than fear. The Church's moral authority depends fundamentally on its claim to represent divine love rather than to manage human terror, to enhance human potential rather than to constrain it through sophisticated moral frameworks. Acknowledging that Christian virtue might be motivated primarily by fear would undermine this foundational claim, challenging not just specific moral teachings, but the very basis of religious moral authority. It's not that religious leaders consciously suppress this insight, but rather that their entire framework depends on maintaining the appearance that virtue emerges from love rather than fear. Cultural narratives reinforce this pattern by consistently portraying goodness as triumph of love rather than sophisticated management of terror. From religious education to popular culture, dominant stories present virtue as expression of compassion rather than response to fear, as enhancement of human potential rather than its constraint through moral frameworks. It's not a conscious conspiracy, but rather the natural evolution of cultural narratives that benefit from maintaining the appearance that goodness emerges from love rather than fear, that virtue enhances rather than constrains human potential. Educational systems often perpetuate this pattern by teaching children that morality emerges from compassion rather than fear. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, most moral teachers still take a completely different path. Even today, they try to persuade man that he has a completely different value from the one he thought he had. This insight reveals how moral education might serve, not just to transmit specific ethical content, but to maintain the appearance that virtue emerges from love rather than fear, that goodness enhances rather than constrains natural human potential. Perhaps most significantly, this pattern remains unacknowledged because addressing it would mean confronting what Nietzsche called the death of God, not merely questioning specific religious beliefs, but recognizing how thoroughly our conception of goodness depends on psychological foundations we're reluctant to examine. This prospect is so challenging that many prefer the familiar comfort of virtue apparently motivated by love to the more demanding terrain of recognizing how fear might shape our moral psychology. The pattern persists not through conscious suppression, but through the simple human preference for comforting moral narratives over disturbing psychological insights. For virtue apparently motivated by love over goodness, potentially driven by fear, and for ethical frameworks that present themselves as enhancement rather than constraint of human potential. As Nietzsche writes in The Antichrist, faith, not wanting to know what is true. This isn't mere condemnation but psychological insight. Our attachment to traditional conceptions of virtue might reflect not just ethical commitment, but unwillingness to examine their actual psychological foundations. What does this mean for the possibility of virtue beyond fear? If we've been collectively engaged in disguising fear as love, what might become possible if we consciously transform the psychological foundation of ethics from fear of power to expression of power, from terror of vitality to affirmation of life? What form of goodness might emerge not from the suppression of natural human potential, but from its enhancement and refinement into forms that affirm rather than diminish life? As we approach our final exploration, we'll examine what Nietzsche's discovery reveals about the possibility of virtue beyond fear, not through rejection of goodness, but through transformation of its psychological foundation. What might emerge if we distinguished between a morality motivated by fear and an ethics emerging from strength? The final question isn't whether to be good, but whether goodness emerges from fear or strength. Nietzsche's discovery reveals something profound about moral psychology, how consistently virtue correlates with the suppression of natural human power, how persistently goodness coincides with the diminishment of vital force, how systematically sanctity aligns with the weakening of what he called the will to power. But it also reveals something even more significant, the possibility of virtue beyond fear, not through rejection of goodness, but through transformation of its psychological foundation. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche articulates this possibility through his concept of gift-giving virtue, a form of goodness that emerges not from fear, but from abundance, not from constraint, but from overflow, not from terror of one's own potential, but from its fullest expression. I love him who squanders his soul, who neither seeks nor offers thanks, because he always gives and does not want to preserve himself. This isn't rejection of virtue, but its psychological transformation, from goodness motivated by fear to ethics emerging from strength, from morality driven by terror to virtue flowing from vital affirmation. This isn't about embracing cruelty or indifference, but transforming how we understand goodness itself, recognizing that authentic virtue might emerge not from the suppression of natural human potential, but from its enhancement and refinement into forms that affirm rather than diminish life. Perhaps the truly good person isn't one who constrains natural impulses through sophisticated moral frameworks, but one who integrates those impulses into meaningful expression. Not one who fears their own power, but one who channels it into forms that enhance rather than diminish life. What might this look like in practice? It means examining your relationship to your own natural power, noticing when you suppress vital impulses not because their expression would harm others, but because you fear what you might become if moral constraints were relaxed. It means asking whether your conception of goodness enhances your natural potential or constrains it through sophisticated mechanisms of self-fear. It means recognizing when you use phrases like, I should be more humble, or I must deny myself. Not because these approaches enhance life, but because they manage the terror of your own vitality. It means developing relationship to natural impulses that neither suppresses them in the name of virtue, nor expresses them without refinement. but rather integrates them into meaningful expression that enhances rather than diminishes life. Anger, not as sin requiring suppression, but as natural energy that can be refined into meaningful assertion. Desire, not as temptation requiring constraint, but as vital force that can be channeled into creative expression. Pride, not as vice demanding humility, but as natural self-affirmation that can be developed into authentic dignity. Most importantly, it means recognizing that the truly good person isn't one who fears their own power, but one who expresses it in forms that enhance rather than diminish life. What Nietzsche called the will to power, in its authentic sense, not as domination, but as creative expression of vital force. This isn't arbitrary self-indulgence, but recognition that authentic virtue emerges not from the suppression of natural human potential, but from its enhancement and refinement into meaningful expression. The path forward isn't about rejecting goodness, but transforming its psychological foundation, from fear of power to expression of power, from terror of vitality to affirmation of life, from dread of potential to its meaningful realization. Whether within traditional moral frameworks or beyond them, authentic virtue requires distinguishing between goodness motivated by fear and ethics emerging from strength, between morality driven by terror and virtue flowing from vital affirmation. What might become possible if you stopped being good from fear and started expressing goodness from strength? What form of virtue might emerge if you distinguished between morality motivated by terror and ethics flowing from vital affirmation? What capacity for meaningful contribution might you discover if you separated authentic goodness from sophisticated self-constraint? The answer to these questions won't come from more perfect moral restraint, but from the courage to question the psychological foundation of virtue itself, to ask whether what you've been taught to call goodness might actually be sophisticated expression of fear disguised as love. As Nietzsche suggests, authentic virtue begins not with more perfect self-constraint, but with the psychological transformation that allows natural human power to express itself in forms that enhance rather than diminish life. The real journey isn't becoming more conventionally good, but transforming the psychological foundation of goodness itself, from fear of power to expression of power, from terror of vitality to affirmation of life. Perhaps, as Nietzsche discovered, the most liberating truth of all is that the truly good person doesn't need Jesus as alibi, doesn't require external moral authority to justify natural human goodness, but discovers within themselves the capacity for virtue emerging from strength rather than fear, from vital affirmation rather than terror of their own potential.